In order to do this, I think we really need a personalised treatment strategy. It's no longer good enough to take people as cohorts into studies and look at generalised treatment interventions. We really have to look at each person as an individual, their own load history, as well as what kind of load exposure is that person experiencing in day-to-day activities. What most of the research kind of does, it takes cohorts, it puts people into groups, it does what we call evidence-based medicine, but this is making an assumption that all people in that cohort are the same and that they'll respond in the same way. And so then what we need to do is move away from that into one that's more personalised or precision medicine, where we treat each individual as their own individual, their own case control. Now this sounds all well and good, and it probably makes sense to many of you sitting amongst the audience, but the real challenge here is how do we achieve this? How do we, particularly with, for example, a platoon or a large cohort of individuals, if you're a trainer or if you're a clinician and you want to have an influence on an individual basis, how do you get that done? And this is really where wearable sensors come in, because wearable sensors now give us an opportunity to measure in the field. We can now integrate the sensors quite well into clothing, into some of the equipment that a warfighter might have or an individual going for a run. But there are some challenges here, and these challenges I want to address. First of all, are these wearable sensors measuring what we want? Because there's lots of gimmicks, there's lots of things out there that can measure lots of stuff. The main question that I have is, what is it that you can measure, and is that really useful information for us? What do we do with this information? We can measure lots of things, we can generate gigabytes of data, and kind of linked to that is this third question: what are the actionable items or outcomes that you get from that information? And if you have some sensors that give you information about the laws of physics, and for the most part we'll talk about inertial sensors here, so these are sensors that can measure accelerations, angular velocities, and sometimes a gyroscopic heading, or think of it as a digital compass. So these are measurements that you could take, that you could integrate with a physics-based model to give you some inference. So one of the first things we did is we put an inertial sensor onto the back of the pelvis, close to the centre of mass, and we asked some elite level sprinters to run with that sensor, and of course we can measure then the linear accelerations from that sensor which is put onto that individual. We can integrate that over time and calculate velocity. So you see from one step to step you see differences in the way that this individual is sprinting. So they're preferring one leg and being dominant on one side. Another thing we were interested in is calculating or estimating low limb power. Now counter movement jump is very often used as a surrogate measure of low limb power. So a maximal height jump to try and maximally activate your extensor muscles and get off the ground. And the same idea here applies, just integrating these in a usable fashion so that a coach and an athlete can get very rapid feedback. And so we've done some validation work on this as well, where we compare the velocities that you might get from, say, traditional motion capture. So we use our Vicon system as our gold standard. We track the vertical height jumps and the velocities, and we then compare that to what we can get with a sensor. So we're moving into some slightly more complicated models now, where we model the human musculoskeletal system as rigid links that are kinematically linked through joints. Now the challenge in doing this is to create a scaled musculoskeletal model that represents that individual. And so what we said to the FDA is, look, why don't we do virtual clinical trials? We'll create a population of individuals, and from that set what you can actually do is you can take this new orthopedic implant and you can virtually test it into this population of 1400 and see how it acts. And this enables us to rapidly then test and create models that represent, or a close representation of your individual. Then what we do is we put on some sensors, and of course our inertial sensors are giving us accelerations of the segments, they're giving us angular velocities. In this case you're seeing the walking patterns of a child with spina bifida. You can imagine this is a gait experiment that's performed in a lab. For us, what we'd like to do is understand how this individual moves outside in the real world. So now what we can do is we can create this musculoskeletal model of this individual, put on some wearable sensors and ask her to walk around for a day. Then we can take this information back and actually calculate the kinematics of that individual under real life situations. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about cumulative load, because this is really relevant to the military context in terms of fatigue loading on musculoskeletal structures. There's some sort of cumulative stress, and this is a mechanical stress on the tissue that leads to some sort of microstrain, microfracture, and then continual load leads eventually to macroscale fracture. And we also know that bone responds more to high strain rate than it does to total number of cycles. So we somehow have to have an approach that integrates these two bits of information in a mechanobiological way that makes sense so that we can do predictions of bone health. And the far-field loads, which are moments that are applied to the bones that you can imagine are bending and twisting the bone, and also this is driven by muscle forces. But you take into account the individual stress that you might experience during every cycle. So for us, we can calculate the peak tibial acceleration for every step, and then we can scale that knowing that bone responds more to increase in strain rate as opposed to number of cycles. So the context we have been using this in is in basketball. So we've got game and training data for 2 years now of athletes. And so you can imagine there's a wealth of data here. We can treat these data on an individual basis, and you can start picking up trends here across the season. And this is really useful if you're interested in periodization. You know, did these guys have a strong workout? Should they be rested? You can start using this information to individually glean out on a person how that works. And we're trying to make that as simple as possible through a startup company, IMeasureU, that we started several years ago. What we're doing now is, of course, linking this to the cloud, where we can then take this data, we can manage it for the players, for the coaching staff, and then, of course, you can wrap around analytics on this. So what we're doing now is actually validating this approach, because we like ultimately to be able to predict whether or not an individual is at risk of a fatigue fracture. There is another approach here to wearable sensors, and it's one of statistical modelling. And it says, look, let's just gather information and data from our sensors, and then we can do some statistical modelling to do some inference or prediction. Now this is a powerful approach, but there are some limitations. Of course, you need large amounts of data to do this type of approach. We want to know what's the stress on the medial and lateral side of your cartilage, because we know that knee osteoarthritis is predominantly occurring on the medial side, on the inside of the knee joint. So what we can do is change the way you walk to reduce that stress and hopefully prolong the need for a joint replacement. And so the real challenge then is to say, well, okay, how do you change someone's gait and how do you tell them what to do? And so what we've done in the past year, this is some work that I did at Stanford with some students several years ago, we use each individual as a case control. We ask that individual to walk on the treadmill and we measure some sort of gait parameter. And within 3 shots, with this kind of root finding problem, you can pretty much nail down the desired gait. And we've showed that this is quite effective. We've done this on a number of different cohorts. And just to finish up, I just wanted to show you how we're giving information back. And we're actually using haptic feedback. We're using small vibrating motors as a tactile feedback on the limb. And what we're doing is providing vibrating feedback about the amount of joint load so that you can change your walking pattern. Initially place sensors on the lower limb. We try and find out where is the best place to actually sense tactile feedback. And it turns out that this area where the Achilles tendon inserts into the gastrocnemius is the most sensitive part, and we can use this very effectively to retrain gait. We can retrain things like foot progression, that's that internal external rotation of the foot, step width. Within 150 steps, we can narrowly define a new gait pattern for that individual. So we can then quickly tell someone this is the way you should walk and give them haptic feedback to do that. I think the world of wearable sensors is here to stay, but I think if you really want to make the most of this information, it will be beneficial if you can do that within the context of understanding the underlying anatomy, biomechanics and physiology of the system that you're trying to infer. And thank you for your attention, thanks for being here, and I hope you will get home tomorrow or tonight.